we are going to be exploring watercolor. So we are on week 27 and we have been playing with different medium. And today is going to be one of my favorite mediums, watercolor. So the thing about watercolor is you can use it in so many different ways. We can use it wet on wet, meaning we wet the paper and then we have extremely wet watercolor. So I'm actually going to use a liquid watercolor that you can mix watercolor with water and have it in a form where you can pour it. Then we can do wet on dry. So we wet our paper, but we keep our watercolor fairly dry and our brush fairly dry. We can do dry on wet. So that means that we start with a dry piece of paper, but we have really wet watercolor. So the difference between pouring that on a dry piece of paper as opposed to pouring it on a wet piece of paper will be interesting to see. And then dry on dry. So a dry piece of paper with a pretty dry brush, pretty dry watercolor medium. Obviously it can't be completely dry because it has to have a little bit of water. The other difference is brushes. You're going to see different things happening with a small round brush as opposed to a flat wide brush. And there's so many different kinds of brushes that you can have just a whole lot of fun just playing with brushes. There is a method of doing subtractive watercolor, and that would be through either masking fluid. So sometimes I'll use rubber cement to do that, or there's actually a watercolor medium called masking fluid that you can buy, or you can use tape, masking tape for that. So let's start there and see where that takes us. Okay, so I sprayed my watercolor with my spray bottle. I find that it works a lot easier to have a spray bottle on hand, and I also have 2 containers of water, one to rinse my brush when it's dirty and one to use clean water for using on the paper, like so. So it's just going where the paper's wet. Let's try it flat and see what happens when it's not tilted. Now I'm going to try it on a dry piece of paper. I actually did that one on a dry piece of paper, but with really wet paint. So it doesn't flow, for one thing, and it has hard edges. I'm going to do wet, and then we're going to use a dry brush. That's actually more dry on dry. I might have taken a little too long to use my brush because That's coming on really dry, so my paper must already be sort of dry. That dried really fast. That's better. The edges are softer. So I just removed color right there. I took my brush and I dried it, a clean dry brush, and I just lifted color out of there. So that's a subtracted method. Clean wet brush. Actually, it's more dry. Clean dry brush. But I think you could also, let's try a clean wet brush. You could also pick up paint by using a clean wet brush. Just like that. So that picks up paint as well. So there's my round brush. Let's try this filbert, which is almost like a flat brush with round sides. See what kind of marks it makes. That's a flat brush. Let's go ahead and try some masking tape. Some parts of watercolor, the brilliance of watercolor is leaving the paper wet in places. So for this picture, I'm going to try to honor that and not fill up the whole page with watercolor. I also love coming back and seeing areas where it's now dry and seeing how it turns out. I love this. Sometimes I come back and I see puddles though, like that in there, and I just try to pick them up a little bit. Or you can take your towel and just blot it. We've done wet on wet, we've done wet on dry, we've done dry on wet. This is one. And we did do dry on dry. It was over here. I covered it with masking tape. We've done masking tape as a subtractive method. We've used a clean dry brush to pull up some paint. I'm also going to spray a dry area. Oh, that's not dry yet. But if you saw just where I stuck my finger, I actually can just pull up paint and take some paint off. But also, let's see if this area will work. So I'm just gonna spritz some water. Oh, it's working right here. And it's gonna spread the paint or pull up the paint. And then I can just take my, oh, it worked over here too. It's working all over the place. This is similar to adding salt to watercolor, except for it's a lot better in humid areas because add salt, sometimes it can still, look at that. That's so cool. It can make humidity underneath the glass. So just using a spray bottle will do that same effect, but you won't get the after effect. So cool. So that's a subtractive method. We have to wait till this dries before I can pull the tape up over there. We've tried different brushes, and on our other cards we talked about mixing. This medium is so easy to mix. I just put some colors into there and it's mixing. If you get an edge that you don't particularly like and want to try, you can go ahead and go in with a clean brush and just pull into the edge. That one was probably a little bit too dry already, but I did take some of the paint out of it, so it will be easier later to maybe soften up. This is way dry, so if I go back into that, I could soften up the edge maybe, but it's gonna be harder. I lightened it barely, so I'm just gonna keep on playing. Watercolor, I can also mix into the lid paint colors. Oh, there's another method for you. Scratching into the paint. Just taking, this is called scarring. Just taking and scratching into the wet paint makes it darker. It also carves the paper, so once it's there, it's not going away. So hardly ever use white watercolor, but since we're experimenting, decided to try it out. See what kind of effect it gave me. I accidentally started using my clean water to clean my brush, so now I'm kind of using this one for the cool colors and this one for the warm colors. But usually I leave one clean. I think I don't know what happened there. Got caught up in the play, wasn't really paying attention. That's probably what happened. I love this medium. I think as you're playing with it, you can just see how it lends itself to exploration. Thought of another thing you could do. So you could either use gravity to let these pools drip, or you could use like a straw and blow them around the thing, but I want to blow them this way, so I'm not even going to use a straw. I'm just going to use my wind. Made me lightheaded. Straws probably work better. I just didn't have one. You could also spray into it and let it drip. Let's see if there's an area that right here is still kind of wet. Kind of took its own path down. And you can kind of just hold your paper up here as long as you want it to, and then you're good with how much it's dripping, then you can lay it back down. The longer you hold it down, the more darker the color's going to. So that's interesting. This paint started to dry, so when I scratched into it, instead of getting darker, it picked up the paint. So a lot of times I would use something like this as my base layer, and then I would start to find shapes in it and then I would use acrylic paints to go on top of it and start to kind of simplify and take stuff out, but it's just fun. I think that this is such a fun way to start any page with watercolor play. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with.